The full book of Eva is available on Amazon, both in paperback and digital form. Links are down in the description if you'd like to check it out. Thank you very much for watching. Eva, Chapter 3. Sleep came to Eva rather easily the first night she spent in Alexander's house, and as she lay there with her eyes closed, she started to realize why she would want to sleep. Of course, she didn't feel tired, but as she lay in her new bed, within her new room, beneath the warmth of her new blankets, she realized that she wanted to rest. She was so comfortable that she let herself drift off into a quiet slumber. Her body became still, her eyes fell closed, and her thoughts drifted away from reality. Earlier that evening, while Alexander was making them both dinner, he requested that she keep a dream journal for when she decided to sleep, and as she remained fully conscious in her dreamlike state, she began to realize why. Her mind began to conjure thoughts and images that drifted into place, and while she was completely still in her bed, in her mind she was walking around this makeshift art gallery full of her own memories. She passed each one, and as she did so, small signs popped up, giving a small indication as to what the memory was about. Some were simply fond times working at the markets. Others were cold nights huddled behind a dumpster. The memory of receiving her blanket stuck out to her. The smile on her face the first night she slept with it made a stupid grin form across her lips before the next memory popped up. Alejandro was standing in the doorway, his back turned to her, and he was arguing with his boss. Eva shook her head and moved on to the next memory. Allison's fist was clenched and dripping with blood as Peter screamed in pain. Winter's cold bite was beating down on her wet cheeks as she ran, faces blurred as she passed them. Her chest was tight, and before she knew it, there were two bright lights looming over her. She covered her head and cried out in fear, but nothing happened. Her arms lowered, and she looked around at Alexander's living room. She laughed as she remembered that she was simply dreaming. She knew that nothing could hurt her, that she could do whatever she wanted. Upon realizing this, an ice cream popped into her hand. It was chocolate mint, and as she took a bite, she walked out of the house. Above her, flying in the sky, was a large red dragon that breathed hot fire across the suburbs. Her ice cream began to melt from the residual heat, and as she licked it up once more, she saw a group of armored figures flying on winged horses, spears drawn as they charged towards the dragon. It was entertaining, but as the battle raged on, Eva began to take a stroll down the street. She saw Alejandro selling burgers from a cart, and Grace was yelling something about pommies nearby. She saw Samantha arm in arm with Cyril, and as she rounded the corner she saw Allison beating Peter to a pulp. She began to wonder if this was the best she could do, dreaming about people she'd known and some fairy tale creatures. The ice cream disappeared from her grasp, and as she started to concentrate, light began to pour from the sky, engulfing everything in sight until there was nothing but blinding white in every direction. It swelled to a point before dissipating, and as it did, it left in its path rolling green hills with small wooden cabins atop them. Nearby there was a medieval-style village, and Eva was now standing on a dirt path. Merchants peddled their wares on the side of the street. Carts were being dragged to and fro, and rising up from the ground at the end of the village was a large stone castle that reached towards the sky. She looked down and saw the elegant blue dress that adorned her body, as well as the golden necklace that hung from her neck. Before she knew it, she'd made her way through the village and into the castle. "Ah, we've been expecting you." An attendant began to guide her towards the throne room. "The king is awaiting your audience." The large wooden doors swung open, and resting in a golden throne at the end of the room was a regal man donning a golden red coat. A crown sat neatly atop his head. Eva's eyes suddenly went wide as her gaze rested upon his face. "'Tis a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance," Alexander said. Eva's eyes shut open as she lay in her bed. The morning sun filtered in through the lace curtains that rested in the front window. Her breathing was heavy and erratic. She hadn't expected him to be there, and as she began to piece together her thoughts, she picked up her dream journal and began writing. She documented most everything that happened, namely the lucidity of her dreams and the almost total control that she had over creating them. She opted to keep the part about Alexander to herself, fearing that he may wish to read the journal at some point. And once she was done, she placed the journal back down on her bed beside the table before making her way downstairs. Alexander was already awake and making breakfast. He looked over at her and saw she was still wearing the same clothes as yesterday. "Oh shit, I completely forgot that you probably need pajamas, huh?" He slid 2 cooked eggs out onto some pieces of toast. "No, it's okay." Eva shook her head and took a seat at the island in the center of the room. "You've already done more than enough. I couldn't—" "Nonsense. He picked up the plate with the food and moved it over until it sat in front of her. We'll go shopping today. Get you some clothes, yeah? She watched as he returned to cooking, unsure if the food he just put down was for her. No, it's okay, I'm fine. Don't be ridiculous. You can't just own one pair of clothes. He flipped another egg before letting it rest, turning to look back at her. Go on then. He gestured towards the plate in front of her. Eat up. Are you sure? She began to speak, but he instantly cut her off. Yes, I'm sure. Shut up and eat, gosh. He laughed and shook his head before continuing to tend to the food that he was preparing. So, how did you sleep? Did you sleep at all? Well, she began to feel slightly embarrassed and took a bite of the toast to avoid having to answer immediately. She was hoping that he would drop the subject, but she soon realized that wasn't going to happen. Yes, I did. It was strange. Strange? He glanced back at her before flipping over one of the eggs. Strange how? It was like I was in control of everything. Well, not at first. At first it was just memories, like an art gallery. As she ate, she began to explain to him her dreams, splicing out the part towards the end, and while she was talking, he finished making himself breakfast and disappeared for a moment to grab a notepad and pen. He was writing something down, almost as if he was documenting everything she was saying. Interesting, he finally spoke up, taking a bite out of his breakfast. So you experienced full lucidity. I suppose that makes sense? What does? She tilted her head. Well, it would make sense for your mind to still be completely active. We just weren't sure how that might affect your sleep. But it sounds like it just makes them super cool. He laughed. I suppose you're right. She let out a soft giggle. It was pretty cool. Breakfast was delicious, and as she ate, she couldn't help but wonder why the food was so good. Sure, it tasted nice, but there was another element to it. It was almost as if for a moment, as she talked over a nice hot meal, that she felt normal. The cold reality that she didn't need the food began to be offset by the fact that she was simply enjoying it, that she liked eating, that the simple act of enjoying a meal brought about a feeling of comfort inside her. She started smiling as she ate, and once she realized she was staring down at her plate with a goofy grin on her face, she began to consider how much she'd been feeling things in the past day. Sadness, confusion, excitement, anxiety, happiness. It had been an insane rollercoaster of emotions since she woke, and that in and of itself was quite startling. Before the accident, she never really experienced such intense feelings. She was complacent, but it was hard to say if she was happy. She enjoyed working at the market, but she wasn't exactly excited about it. She sometimes felt lonely, and she was never really sad. Now it felt like she was experiencing one of those emotions every other hour. Excited that she can live in a normal home, but terribly sad that she's no longer a normal person. She's happy that she gets a second chance at life, but terrified at what the future might hold. Even if she ran away, even if she tried to go back to her old life, living in her worn-down room inside a warehouse, even if she went back to being an observer, sitting lonely on a park bench while she watched people enjoy their lives, that wouldn't be fair to Alexander. She looked up from her plate to watch him, her large blue eyes scanning over his every movement. She could tell he was holding back his excitement, that he wanted to study her and observe her and run a million tests on her. But he was acting normal, kind. He was being patient, even though she was, for all intents and purposes, a project for him to work on. That alone was a confusing mess. She didn't want to consider that his kindness was only a pretense, and that he was just waiting to study her and then toss her away like an old toy. She shook her head as he finally noticed her staring at him and returned to look at the nigh empty plate of food. She wanted to believe he was better than that, even if she barely knew him. She got up once she was done and cleaned her plate, resting it on the drying rack before shuffling quietly out of the kitchen and into the living room. She sat on the couch for a while, quietly watching whatever was on TV because she felt too intimidated by the complicated-looking remote to try and find something that she actually enjoyed. It seemed to be mostly news and infomercials, which garnered no interest from her, leaving her to sit quietly and daydream until Alexander came in. Alright, you ready? He asked, pulling a tie on around his neck. He was dressed for work, it seemed, black slacks and a white t-shirt with a tie. She had seen him wearing something similar the day before, but didn't think much of it. She nodded, unsure as to what he was exactly talking about. Sweet, well, I have no idea what kind of clothes you like, so I guess we can just play it by ear. He laughed and moved into the hallway to grab his keys. Eva turned off the TV and hopped to her feet. She was already mostly dressed, besides the fact that she needed to put her shoes on. Okay, she smiled softly, moving past him to get to the shoe rack. I'm not exactly sure either. I've never really gone shopping. Really? Alexander patted his pockets to make sure he had everything he needed. How did you get clothes then? Oh please, she shook her head, pulling her shoes on and tying them. You seem smart. You've already figured out that I was homeless. Well, I didn't want to assume. He looked utterly guilty. Charity drives, mostly. She shrugged and straightened herself up. Hand-me-downs, old clothes, stuff like that. I see. He opened the door, waited for her to step outside, and then locked it behind him. How did you even sustain yourself? Soup kitchens? Shelters? No. She began to feel embarrassed, rushing ahead of him to get to the car in order to buy herself some time to think of a response. She started thinking about the market, about Allison and Grace, and she sighed. I helped out at the farmer's market. They gave me food as thanks. I see. She could tell that Alexander wanted to press her further, but he shifted the subject instead. Well, off to the mall then? He unlocked the car, sat down in the driver's seat, and strapped himself in. Eva was quick to do the same on her side, and as they pulled out of the driveway, she spoke up once more. I don't usually go to malls. She shifted in her seat. Why's that? Alexander blurted out before his eyes widened in the sudden realization that he'd just asked a previously homeless person why they never went to the mall. Not much of a people person, she responded after noticing the look of panic, a smile on her face. Ah, makes sense. Alexander looked embarrassed but relieved. He even seemed thankful for her response, but Eva could tell that he continued to silently kick himself for asking such a ridiculous question. It didn't take them long to arrive at the mall, and Eva spent most of the ride intently staring out the window at the people they passed. Once they were inside the incredibly large building, surrounded by a sea of unfamiliar faces, Eva couldn't help but begin to feel anxious. She shuffled closer to Alexander and grew increasingly quiet as he started guiding her through the building. Her eyes began to dart around as they walked, and she couldn't help but pick up the minute details about the people that she was passing. Overhearing conversations and curiously observing everyone's body language. She was eventually distracted by Alexander guiding her into a clothing store. Rows upon rows of clothes of all kinds were on display. Mannequins were posing like regular fashionistas, and attendants were wandering around, restocking or talking to the few customers that were making their way through the store. So, Alexander scratched the back of his head as he stopped in front of the women's section. What kind of stuff do you like? Eva stared blankly up at him, blinking a few times before shrugging. I have no idea. Oh, well, I was hoping you would. He trailed off as one of the workers walked up to them. Hi, the young woman said. Eva stared at her for a moment. She was quite pretty, thin, blonde, and she looked like she spent hours doing her makeup. I think so, Eva finally responded after a few moments of silence. I don't know what I'm looking for, though. That's okay. The woman smiled jubilantly and started talking borderline gibberish about the clothes hanging in front of them. And as she was talking, Eva noticed Alexander pretending to be interested in some clothes a few racks away. Once he got far enough from Eva and the attendant, he made his way to some nearby chairs and took a seat. His lack of enthusiasm about something that he suggested confused her. But before she could decide whether or not she thought it was funny, or if it annoyed her, she heard the woman ask, So what do you think? Eva replied, shifting in spot. Something like this? She indicated to her current clothes, much to the woman's disappointment. Oh, sweetie. She shook her head and started pulling clothes off the rack. You are far too pretty to be in those simple clothes. Oh, Eva shrugged. I don't know if... Let's try some stuff on. The woman cut her off. If you don't like it, we can find some clothes that fit your current style. She smiled and started arranging the clothes that she was holding into multiple outfits. Well, Eva thought about it for a moment. She couldn't really see it being a bad thing to at least try. Plus, she did quite like the look of that cute black top the woman was holding. Okay, fine, she nodded. But if I don't like it... You will! The woman cut her off again. Come on. Eva started getting pulled along towards the dressing room. I'm Jane, by the way. Eva could feel Jane's fingers gently rubbing her skin. You have such soft skin, the woman exclaimed, cutting herself off. Eva just chuckled uncomfortably before making her way into the dressing room. Thanks. She gave a rather quiet, meek reply as Jane started laying out the clothes on the small bench that was inside the small room. So, the woman began speaking again. This one, she pointed to a rather small tank top and knee-length skirt, is like, a cute little summer outfit with that breezy top and the skirt, perfect for going to the beach or whatever. She giggled and pointed to the next one, a long, thin white dress that looked like it would go down to about Eva's ankles. This is super cute. Perfect for just going out. You can just throw it on and look fab, okay? Eva nodded as they moved to the next outfit, which was already Eva's favorite. A black tank top matched with a lacy thin jacket and a pair of simple denim jeans. For when you want a more casual look, but you still want to look bombin'. This jacket is super sexy. I think you could pull the look off, girl. Just saying. Finally, the last outfit was a bit more Eva's speed. It was plain and simple, with a blue short-sleeved top that came down to cover only half her abdomen, and a pair of denim jean shorts to finish it off. Something for just everyday wear, you know? Like, hey, look at me, I'm super chill, but I'm still like a beast, you know? Eva didn't know, but she nodded anyway. The enthusiasm of the woman was enough on its own to make her excited to try the clothes on, and as they spent the majority of the next 2 hours in the store trying on different outfits and settling into a specific style, Eva grew increasingly more and more comfortable. At first, she didn't really speak much. She was quiet and withdrawn, mostly just nodding along with whatever Jane suggested, but as they continued picking out outfits, Eva slowly started becoming more vocal, requesting to try specific designs, pieces of clothing, asking questions. She started to realize that she was becoming genuinely interested, that the more that she talked about it and the more that she tried things on, the more she found herself enjoying the mere act of testing things out. Under the magnificent guidance of Jane and a few hours of intense shopping, they finally settled on an appropriate wardrobe. With mostly light colors and comfortable clothes that still leaned towards the stylish side, Eva felt confident that she was going to enjoy her new outfits. As Jane took the outfits they both approved of and started ringing them up on the till, Eva began to notice that Alexander was no longer in the store. The logical part of her realized quickly that he most likely got bored and wandered off to do something else, but the emotional, anxious, guilt-ridden side of her quickly began overpowering her rationality, and she had to lean on the counter in front of Jane to stop herself from collapsing in panic. Her legs, despite being physically incapable of feeling weak, began to feel weak, and her breathing became increasingly rapid. Her eyes frantically started darting around the store in search of Alexander, but to no avail. She began to realize that he left her, that her selfish desire to wear clothes became too much for him, and he abandoned her in the store to let her fend for herself. "Are you okay?" Jane asked, and Eva simply nodded her head. Though her hyperventilation and evidently weak stance said otherwise. Eva was alone once again. She would have to go back to living in the cold, by herself, no friends, no family, nothing. Just a lonely existence where the only people who cared about her were in her own imagination. Alexander walked into the store, a bag hanging from his hand and a concerned look on his face as he saw her half collapse on the counter. Instantly, all the terrible thoughts that had begun clouding her mind dissipated, and the rational logic explanation rang through her mind once more. She pulled herself up and regained her composure, her eyes still fixated on him as he walked closer. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked before Jane interjected. She just started freaking out. It was super crazy. I thought I'd have to call an ambulance or something. She laughed nervously and Eva looked over to her. "I'm sorry, She trailed off. "She's just a bit anxious." Alexander smiled and Jane seemed to have a moment of recognition. Yeah, my cousin has anxiety and she's super uncomfortable in public. I totally get it, but you seemed so fine." She looked over at Eva. "You were all bumping with excitement. It was totes adorable, not gonna lie." She giggled and continued to ring up the clothes. Yeah. Eva laughed somewhat embarrassedly before her eyes suddenly shot wide open when she saw the cost of the clothes raising higher and higher. "That will be $485. Jane smiled, looking at Eva before shifting her focus to Alexander as he pulled out his wallet. "No!" Eva shook her head. "That's too much. I don't need all of it. I don't need any of it." She reached up to try and pull Alexander's hand down. Too late. Alexander laughed at her failed attempt to stop him, handing over his credit card to Jane. "You're not going to make me wait around for 3 hours for nothing." "I won't wear it then." She pouted and folded her arms over her chest. "Oh, sweetie." Jane took the card and proceeded with the payment. "That'll just be a waste of good clothes." "Exactly," Alexander agreed. "Consider it a birthday present." "You don't even know when my birthday is." Eva let out an audible huff as the transaction completed, and Alexander started picking up the bags of clothes. "Thank you very much." Alexander smiled at Jane. "My pleasure," Jane responded, the both of them seeming to ignore Eva's formal act of protest. "You have a good day now." Alexander started making his way out of the store, and at first, Eva didn't move. She stood in defiance to them being nice to her before realizing that he was calling her bluff and leaving without her. She quickly panicked and looked at Jane. "Thank you so much for your help. You were really great. Thank you." She stammered out before rushing to catch up with Alexander, who was sauntering his way through the mall. "Oh, hey," he said as she caught up to him. "Nice of you to make it." "That was mean," she huffed and folded her arms again. "You can't just ignore me and do whatever you want." Well, I wasn't going to argue about it for an hour. Besides, you needed clothes. Not that many. She shook her head as she felt the familiar feeling of guilt creeping up on her. Pay me back by cooperating on your test today. He smirked at her, and she responded by opening her mouth, then closing it and huffing once more. Fine, she said, a notable tinge of irritation in her voice. Once they returned to the car, Alexander put all the bags in the back seat apart from a single one, which he placed in her lap once he settled into his seat. What's this? She asked curiously, peering down at the bag before slowly opening it. Another gift. I went and got it while you were shopping. He clicked his seatbelt in and started up the car. I wasn't sure how you would feel about it, but considering how shaken you looked when I got back, I figured it'd come in handy. Oh my gosh. She pulled out the box within the bag. On the front of it was a picture of a sleek-looking cell phone. Alexander, I can't... She began to speak, but he quickly cut her off. Take it. I'll need to be able to contact you if we're ever apart, he smiled. When is your birthday, anyway? She opened the box and began inspecting the phone. She'd never actually owned one before, so it was a rather exciting prospect. I actually don't know. She shook her head and put her phone back in the box for later. Somewhere in winter, I think. You think? He tilted his head, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yeah, I think so. When I was little, She paused. My mother would try and do something special for me. We'd go and buy the biggest cake she could afford, and she'd stay up all night. Eva shook her head and pulled her sleeve up to wipe a few tears from her eyes. We'd just have fun. We fixed an old projector and we would stay up watching movies. She cleared her throat after realizing how shaky her voice had become. Ah, well, that sounds like fun, Alexander smiled. What kind of movies? You know. Eva was expecting him to start asking about her mother, but his restraint caused a smile to cross her lips. Just fantasy stuff. I was little. I loved all things mystical and magical. That explains the dragon, then, Alexander laughed. Dragon? Eva asked before remembering her dream. Oh, yeah. Brave knights, witches, wizards, elven warriors. I've always loved that stuff. We've got ourselves a regular nerd over here. Alexander grinned a rather cheeky grin at her. Hey, she huffed. I just like it, okay? Besides, you'll want to talk, Mr. Elves of Ardale. Whoa now, Alexander laughed again. I'm a fan of good literature, okay? Well, you're also a nerd then. She stuck her tongue out at him. Fine. I concede to your point, you little snoop. Alexander's laugh died down into a chuckle and Eva scoffed before speaking once more. I was actually going to ask you if it would be okay if I borrowed some of your books. She fiddled with her thumbs. You've already done so much, but Yes, it's fine. He nodded and waved a hand dismissively. Feel free to read any of the books in my study. Thank you. Eva smiled up at him, and he nodded in response. The rest of the car ride was relatively uneventful, and it wasn't long before they were home. Alexander told her she only had an hour to sort her clothes into her wardrobe before she had to get ready to leave for the hospital, so in response, she tried her best to comply. She rushed upstairs to organize her clothes, and once that was done, she spent the rest of the time setting up her new phone. Almost 2 hours later, they were pulling into the hospital parking lot, and Eva couldn't help but feel optimistic about the rest of the day. She peered out the window at the tall, looming building that stretched up into the sky before looking at Alexander. The car ride was mostly quiet. Eva had spent the majority of it curiously investigating the properties of her new phone, but since they had arrived, she decided to speak up. What kind of tests do you need to do? First, we're just doing a diagnostic on all your systems, Alexander replied as he pulled into his parking spot. You know, checking everything is running properly, making sure nothing is malfunctioning or acting outside of set parameters. I see. Eva nodded, and for the first time she didn't feel confused or upset about the reality of her new body. Then we're going to do some physical attribute tests. Nothing too serious. You've already shown immense progress in your motor function skills, so what I'd like to do is confirm that your neural storage has appropriately integrated into the hardware. He turned his car off and looked at her. She was blankly staring at him, trying to piece together what he just said. I need to make sure that your mind is working with your body. Ah, Eva nodded. Okay, I think I understand. Good. He smiled and stepped out of the car. Eva began to follow him into the hospital once the car was locked, trailing closely behind him so as to not be lost within the crowd of people. They moved straight past the front desk and immediately headed to the elevators, navigating a few floors up before returning to the section of the hospital that Eva had awoken in. She paid attention to the signs on the walls this time as she followed. It seemed as though they were heading towards a small section of the hospital called the Biological Engineering Facility. As they made their way through the locked doors and into the reception area, a young woman behind the counter immediately rose to her feet and pointed a finger at Alexander. "Dr. Baker!" she exclaimed. "You cannot just take a patient out without warning anyone." "Ah, sorry, Liz." Alexander chuckled at the woman. "She's fine, though. See?" He gestured towards Eva, who was half hiding behind Alexander. "That's not the point," the woman huffed. "Dr. Carter requested that you go see him the moment that you arrived." Yes, of course." Alexander waved a hand at her rather dismissively before turning to Eva. "I've got to go square this out. Liz will take care of you, all right?" Eva simply nodded in response before he began walking away. He disappeared behind a door on the other side of the room, leaving Eva standing awkwardly in the hallway before Liz looked over to her and sighed. "Well, come take a seat, miss." She paused, waiting for an answer. "Eva," the girl simply responded. "Eva? Oh, don't tell me he's making you call yourself that." The woman shook her head in obvious irritation. "No," Eva responded as she made her way over to the counter. "I like it." "But surely you had a name before, right?" Liz sat down in her chair and leaned back. "Well, yes, but it doesn't matter." Eva shook her head and smiled. "I like Eva." "All right then, Miss Eva. Take a seat. Someone should be by to take you soon." The woman began working on her computer once more, but Eva popped up with another question. "Where did Alexander go?" she asked, peering over the counter at the woman. "Dr. Baker is currently being chewed out, I imagine." The woman let out an annoyed sigh. "Why?" Eva tilted her head. "Because he wasn't supposed to discharge you, and yet he decided to go ahead and do it anyway. Only he made it worse by not telling anyone." She grit her teeth. "He just walked out. Then I caught the flack for it because of what he did. So now I have a mountain of paperwork to sort through, and he only gave me his half-assed apology." She began fiddling with a pen as she spoke, but by the time she was finished her sentence, she threw it onto the desk. "So now he's in trouble with this Carter guy?" Eva asked, trying to ignore the woman's irritated state. "Dr. Carter. Not that he can do much about it. Dr. Carter is Dr. Baker's second hand. He might go to the board if Dr. Baker pisses him off more." "Oh." Eva slunk back. "Thanks for answering me." She sunk down into one of the chairs in the room. They were quite comfortable, but Eva was more focused on the sudden feeling of guilt that began to weigh her down. It would be just her luck to ruin yet another person's life just by existing, and so as she sat there, lamenting the thought, she pulled her knees up to her chest and buried her face between them, sighing heavily.